This is a preparatory video for the session on 12th of January, which looks at mission in an age of ecological breakdown, or mission in the Anthropocene. In it, I will be arguing that the environmental crisis is the context in which all of our mission, ministry, and theology is undertaken. In 2020, the General Synod of the Church of England committed the Church to being carbon net zero by 2030. This is a culmination of an ever-increasing engagement on the part of the Church of England with what has been hitherto termed environmental issues. Each diocese, and ideally each PCC, should have someone responsible for this aspect of our mission. If you do not know who your diocesan environmental officer is, then finding out is an easy way to start thinking about a Christian response to ecological breakdown. They are great sources of support and knowledge, and many of their web pages have a great deal of information on them. National church structure. There is an environment programme, a lead bishop on the environment, and a small team of staff to support this. Again, it's worth looking it up as they have a lot of information and an extensive collection of webinars on topics which may be of interest to those of you undertaking this course. Ecumenically, churches have been introduced to the idea of Creation Tide, which runs from 1st of September to 4th of October, and encourages reflection on the creation as God's creation and our responsibilities to it. And we are encouraged also to hold a Climate Sunday with a variety of liturgical resources to support both. If you're seeking to lead worship on an environmental theme, then there is certainly no need to reinvent the wheel. Considerable resources are already available. Since the late 60s and early 70s, there has been a growing subdiscipline in theology known as environmental theology or ecological theology, or most likely eco-theology. And if you're looking at the area from a multi-faith perspective, then there is a subdiscipline called religion and the environment. This has led to a growth of theological reflection on the environment and to courses like this one. All of these things are to be welcomed and suggest that the Church of England and the Church more broadly has been becoming increasingly aware and responsive to environmental challenges. Yet, at the same time, there is a danger in these approaches, in that they can lead us to imagine that the environment is a social issue, like many others, one issue amongst many. But is it? Or that Christian consideration of creation can be squeezed into a 5-week worship block, or even a Sunday, and then forgotten about for the rest of the year. Or that a theological treatment of the environment is the realm of environmental specialists, a discrete area which is interesting for those who like that sort of thing, but everyone else can just get on with theology, mission and worship as usual and leave it to the experts. The danger is that such approaches can leave us imagining that the environment is wholly unconnected to the rest of theology, mission and church life. But if we think about the word environment, which comes from Old French and refers to terms such as surround and enclose, we can begin to see that thinking about the environment cannot be considered merely as an issue or exist in a silo as something discrete or unconnected from everything else. Rather, it touches everything. Something which surrounds or encloses touches every aspect of what it surrounds or encloses. Similarly, if we think about ecology, a science which describes the relatedness of living things with their environments, their interdependence and interconnectedness, that we can see that a silo or an issue approach is unsatisfactory. If everything is connected, we can't think about ecological theology in a silo. Conradi, in his comprehensive treatment of ecological theology in 2008, which I've suggested as your core text, argues that there is no need to add environmental concerns to an already overcrowded social agenda of local churches and ecumenical bodies. Instead, the entire life and praxis of the Church should include an ecological dimension and vision. Conradi and many others argue for a theological reformation of Christianity, which entirely orients it in an ecological direction. There are various reasons why he argues that this is so, but one is to give Christianity a contemporary relevance for mission. David Clough, a leading environmental ethicist who also works in the area of systematic theology, argued that eco-theology is no longer necessary and it is time to move beyond it, not because it is not important, but because all theology should include ecological elements. He suggests it is no longer appropriate, if it ever were, for any theologian to fail to take account of ecological concerns in their work, and that any theological project that fails to attend to ecological questions where relevant fails to be an adequate theology as such. Insights such as these lead me to suggest that we think about the environment not in terms of an issue, or even the most pressing issue of the day, but as a context. Those of you who are in my contextual mission session will be familiar with my definition of context as the water in which we swim, the interrelated set of circumstances in which something exists or occurs. I am suggesting that we are existing and occurring in a context of environmental breakdown. So therefore, I am advocating framing it as a context, and that the concept of the Anthropocene is one way of thinking about this context. Rapid and widespread adoption of the term Anthropocene is indicative of this sense that we are living in an era defined by environmental problems. Thinking about the ecological crisis in terms of the Anthropocene is helpful because it enables us to capture the multiple intersecting crises that are occurring. We are very familiar with talking about the environment in terms of a crisis or an emergency. However, we should be speaking of crises in the plural. These crises are now understood to be so problematic that they present a threat to continued human existence and the existence of numerous other species besides. They extend beyond the climate crisis to disruptions to the ocean and atmospheric currents, disturbances in the water cycle, disturbances of other chemical cycles, soil degradation, a rapid loss of biodiversity, pollution and non-biodegradable substances, an ever-growing human population, and vast global inequality. All of these are crises, but they intersect with one another and impact on each other. The idea of the Anthropocene was introduced in 2000. In February of that year, at the annual meeting of the International Geosphere-Biosphere Programme, the Vice Chair, Paul Crutzen, lost his patience. Crutzen had won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for his work on the ozone layer, and he had spent the day listening to his colleagues detail the profound changes that the Earth was undergoing. They keep referring to the present as the Holocene, a geographical designation for the present geological epoch. After listening to them all day, Crutzen interrupts. Stop using the word Holocene. We aren't in the Holocene anymore. We are in the Anthropocene. The term Anthropocene means New Age of Man. Crutzen originally suggested it as a name for a new geological epoch. There is a strict definition and criteria for establishing this, and whether we have actually entered a new geological epoch is still very much up for debate. There is also considerable debate about when the Anthropocene might have begun. And if you wish to learn more about this aspect, I have put Yavinder Mali's extensive literature search on Moodle. It's a long read and it's not essential reading, but it may be of interest to some of you. Crutzen, together with Eugene Stromer, suggested that humans had become a geological force whose impact could be discerned on a planetary scale. Although the term is still contested geologically, the term Anthropocene was widely adopted in a less formal sense to indicate the extent to which humans had become a dominant species on a global scale. Mali suggests that the core concept that the term is trying to capture is that human activity is having a dominating presence on multiple aspects of the natural world and the functioning of the Earth system, and that this has consequences for how we view and interact with the natural world and perceive our place in it. As you will have noted from having watched the David Attenborough video, a characteristic of the Anthropocene is an awareness that as a species we are exceeding planetary limits in multiple areas. In 2009, Johan Rockström published an article arguing that some of the parameters of Earth systems are currently in the process of exiting the safe operating space for humanity, based on the state of those parameters in pre-industrial times. 3 of these thresholds have already been exceeded: biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle, and climate change. Although the Attenborough video focuses on climate change, Rockström identified 9 such limits, which can be seen on the infographic on this slide. Climate change is only one of these. If you have Netflix, you might like to watch the entire documentary of which the Attenborough video was a taster. It's called Breaking Boundaries. And if you wish to research the idea of planetary limits further, I have included a Moodle link to the research website of Stockholm Resilience Centre. Until recently, Rockström was the centre director there, and they were at the cutting edge of research in planetary boundaries. I've also included a 2009 article by Rockström on Moodle. Both of these may be heavy going for you if, like me, you are not from a scientific background, but some of the material on the website is accessible enough if you look hard enough. But the key idea here is that there are multiple crises and that planetary boundaries are being exceeded, and that there are limits, and that the Earth has finite resources. As well as having a specific scientific definition, the Anthropocene is also widely used to speak of the now. There is an ever-increasing number of books and articles that include "in the Anthropocene" in their title, which consider the implications of the Anthropocene for different specialisms. So we've got health psychology in the Anthropocene, art in the Anthropocene, accounting in the Anthropocene. In this sense, the term is being used to replace or supplement the contested term postmodernity or postmodernism as a description of the age in which we are living. If you think back to your mission module, you will remember the different missional paradigms that Spencer articulated. He was following the work of Kung and Bosch in arguing that theology and mission are contextual, as Christians are both unconsciously affected by their context and deliberately engage with it. He suggested 6 different historical paradigms in which theology and mission were expressed differently and contextually appropriately. He describes the paradigm in which we are presently living as mission in postmodernity, whilst he suggests that a feature of the postmodern context is the ecological crisis. Arguably, the Anthropocene in itself requires a new paradigm. The reason why I suggest this is because the situation we find ourselves faced with is unprecedented and magically new. Until very recently, humans have not been a geological force like wind or oceans, and we certainly haven't been aware of ourselves as being such. The Anthropocene is what is known as a non-analog state, and this means that we are entering a new territory, unlike anything we have known before, and we have nothing to compare it to. Many academic disciplines are calling for new ways of thinking, new stories, and new worldviews. I have included videos from Kate Raworth, the author of Doughnut Economics, who is calling for a new economic paradigm, and George Monbiot, who is calling for a new story. You might wish to watch these if you have time. Both emphasize the need for a break with the past and argue that new ways of thinking are required. Whilst we may disagree with their conclusions, personally I don't, but you are free to, they are part of a groundswell suggesting that navigating the Anthropocene cannot be done without new visions and new ways of thinking appropriate to this context. The questions that the Anthropocene raises for Christianity and some potential approaches for addressing them will be discussed next week. Working from within the discipline of history, Dipesh Chakrabarty suggests that the Anthropocene requires an end to the dualism which separates humans and nature, which has been part of the worldview of the Enlightenment and modernism, and also an end to the distinction between humanities subjects and scientific enquiry. People studying the humanities need to become more scientifically literate, while those working in the scientific community need to be more attentive to humanistic disciplines such as psychology and perhaps even theology. He also suggests that we need to consider what it means to talk about humans as a species, the dominant species, but a species nonetheless, at the same time as considering what it means to be an individual, or how different human beings experience things differently. When we begin to talk about humans as a species, which we do when we use words like anthropogenic climate change caused by people, or the Anthropocene, we must be aware of how this erases the differentiated experience of individuals and groups. When we do it, we're speaking as if all humanity is the same, and we're not differentiating between the experience of the whole and the experience of individual people. But do we experience events as a species, with everyone's experience being the same? And, as a species, are we all equally responsible for ecological breakdown? A key problem in thinking about humans as a species and using the term Anthropocene is where it apportions blame. Who is responsible for exceeding these planetary boundaries? The human species? Or some members of the human species more than others? Is it the fault of all human beings, or some? Jason Moore argues that a more appropriate term than Anthropocene is Capitalocene, which suggests that capitalism and the desire for wealth and constant economic growth is at the root of the problem, not simply behaviour and population growth on the part of the human species. He argues that thinking in terms of the human species disguises the degree to which the exceeding of planetary boundaries and ecological threats are the result of a particular economic system which has worked to the benefits of some and not others. Thus, a note of caution needs to be injected into thinking about the environmental crisis or the Anthropocene as a context suggests a holistic human experience which is shared by everyone. Picard suggests it is rather a special context which touches practically everyone in the world. Ecosystems around the world have been damaged. Many of the so-called planetary boundaries are either exceeded or in danger of being exceeded, and climate change is causing unstable weather worldwide. However, even though the ecological crisis in some way touches everyone, at the present moment there are vast differences in the levels of impact and vulnerability that people face. Often the poorest people suffer most from the ecological crisis because they do not have as many resources to react to problems or prevent them. There are vast structural injustices. We may want to think about the Anthropocene as the meta or overarching context that the whole human species is experiencing, but that there are more localized micro contexts which differ depending on local or individual circumstances. The Anthropocene that we are experiencing is not the same as that of the Polynesian islanders, whose homes are amongst the most vulnerable to flooding due to climate change. The Anthropocene that a homeless person experienced in this summer's heatwave was different from the Anthropocene that those in air-conditioned offices experienced. And as we will see in the presentation on environmental racism, the experience of Black and brown people may well differ from that of white people. So we can therefore think of the Anthropocene as the storm, which we are weathering in different boats, and be aware of this in our reflections when we address the questions that the Anthropocene raises. I'd like you to consider how you feel about this. If you are confused, you are not alone. If there were easy answers, then humanity would not have found itself in this predicament at all. But you may also find yourselves concerned or worried or even anxious. I believe that a defining characteristic of the Anthropocene, from the perspective of people living in it, is an awareness that as a species, we have the potential to destroy the optimum conditions for human life, yet as individuals, we are powerless to prevent this. The Anthropocene raises issues of power, of guilt, of fear, and what resources does the Christian faith have to address these? An increasing area of study is eco-anxiety and how people are feeling frightened in the wake of the Anthropocene and ecological degradation. The article by Panu Pikala that I've included in your preparatory reading begins to address and raise some of the issues of eco-anxiety and living in the Anthropocene, and the questions that this raises for Christianity. And we will be discussing these further in our online session. I look forward to hearing what you think.